It's been a great day, and I think if we take a step back, we've obviously been to the clouds and come back down again, and I think it's been a great perspective of the different angles around what we're actually trying to deal with here. We've got a lot of dynamic systems going on, and it's trying to work out how do we best, end of the today, get something out of this so we can go home and do something tomorrow. And I guess want to just recap where we've been and pick up some of those key elements that I've got out of it, and hopefully you did too, and happy to debate that all later. But really, where we're going with this this whole journey and where we're, how you can best set up the system to best benefit your management, your approach to farming, and overall the environmental benefits. So we'll start. So ultimately, I just wanted to capture the key elements that have come out today that I've grabbed out of it. So we want to join the dots because everything that's been presented to you today has an overlapping factor. And I think it's just how does that factor overlap you in your position, in your management and what production system you're in. So we've got working through, we had the climate, the water element, the soil, the carbon neutral factor, and the markets, and then the microbes. So these are sort of the elements that we as farmers have to engage with and work through the step change on how we best leverage each of these components to the benefit of our own systems. So starting from the start, if we wind back, it seemed a while ago since when Dr. Peter Heyman was up here, really trying to capture us with some really key buzzwords around what's going on with the climate. And it's pretty frank. It was touched on. It's warming. It's us. We're sure. It's bad. But we can fix it. And I think some of those elements have really been captured today. And I think different things are going to be one for different people. Denial and despair can lead to inaction. But I think out of today, hopefully that journey has been set up to say, where is some of the pathway for action for you? Because when we're up in the clouds talking about the climate, it all does seem doom and gloom. But I think most of the people here today would be looking for this positive opportunity on saying, how can I do something different on my place to have a positive impact on my land, my environmental future, and my overall farming enterprise and its future. So ag was touched on is both a source and a sink of emissions, and we can go and debate that whole process through, and it was obviously touched on finding that balance of that source and sink, but with that, how do we brake and steer? So the brake and steer element, I think, has been really touched on. I think we've had a bit of brake. Where do we use the brake? Where do we steer? How do we navigate this whole climate opportunity, the carbon markets, the market access, and how do we tie those elements together? And then work on supercharging. And I think one thing that Peter didn't touch on was the accelerator component. And I think people like Christine are really bringing forward that accelerator component on saying, how can we really leverage some of these systems? So degrees change, and I think degrees, when we talk about degrees, it's like unrelatable, yes, in some ways. Small degree changes, it's like, it changes between 10 to 20 degrees. 20 degrees, you might take your jumper off, might be earlier than that. Other people wear a t-shirt when it's above 25. So we're used to bigger increments. But I thought from a farming perspective, farmers are really used to dealing with small temperature increments. And I guess when we are talking about degree change, at 1.5 degrees, that increase in temperature is essentially guaranteed. So that we're on a risk management strategy for that 1.5 degrees. The trajectory is potential for 4.4 degrees, which we've commented as a different planet. And I think when you wind back your own production systems, think about your own soil. Think about your soil when it's 10 degrees. Think about how slow things grow and the slow process that happens when they're 10 degrees. But when you're up at 14, 15 degrees, how quick things grow. You've got quick germination all around that plant and soil interaction and the microbial activity. Those things you're dealing with on a daily basis. And I think this is the big thing with agriculture on being the saviour and being the sink on soil carbon as an element, is that we have been producing plants for a number of years. It's just how do we find the step change in the production system, because what we're doing is not enough. So how do we step through that? So climate system is an angry beast. We are poking it with a stick. But really, I think out of today is we need to not poke it with a stick, we need to grow more sticks. So a warmer world is a hotter world, but that's only for the mid latitudes. It's actually a lower rainfall environment. So we've got to be careful of the big numbers compared to what the numbers mean on our own farm. And this is a critical element I want for you to take away today, is with big numbers, what does it mean for your own farm? Because we've got to put these big numbers in relative context to your own property. So similar rainfall, but higher temperatures. So we're not putting the bottle of wine on the table for the rainfall element, but we are putting the more expensive bottle of wine on the table for the higher temperatures. Higher temperatures with similar rainfall, what does that mean for decomposition and cycling of carbon? It's going to potentially accelerate that change. Think about it when the largest sort of soil carbon stocks naturally in the world, we start looking at the peat bogs in Scotland. Cold, dreary, the old Scots up there, and then we look at the tropical system, higher moisture, higher temperature, higher cycling. It's harder to build and retain that carbon in that, especially in those surface soils, as Christine touched on, and that is a really critical element. Water demand and water quality issues. So this is going to be the big one for anyone irrigating. Is water demand. Yes, that water demand might vary, and that evaporation commentary is really important too. But as water quality and water demand start interacting, you've got compounding factors. And a classic when you're dealing with irrigated landscapes, especially in more marginal country of marginal water sources, as the water is, the soil will become. So if you've got high loading of salts and that sort of thing in your water, if you keep applying that to your soil, your soil is going to be going on a degradational slide. Naturally, we're born lawyers, not scientists. Really critical thing, and I think that's the hardest thing. As soon as we get new science or new opinions are put forward, quite often we'll debate why they're wrong, rather than saying, look at the angles and ask ourselves of what our own observations are. Remembering science is a review of observations on how we can communicate that within our farming systems. And I think as us as farmers need to be working out how we're conveying that to the general community as well. Enough with the starting of the climate. We then went on to Margaret Jewell looking at the MLA and looking at some of these real drivers as to why we are going down this carbon journey and the carbon neutral 2030. Carbon neutral 2030, I know when it was stamped in there, it was sent a bit of a ripple through saying, what does it mean for us on the ground? But I think hopefully that was clarified for you today. It's really a productivity-led initiative. And it's not necessarily saying that you on the ground has to be carbon neutral, but the industry is what it's got its target on. So we want to be achieving carbon neutrality, as well as other benefits for the growers as well. We've got, I think, half the room sort of looking at the red meat production, double the value of red meat sales, half the cost of compliance. These are great big ticks, but then having targets on carbon neutrality, on what that means for the markets going forward, is really quite exciting. So how do you do your bit? I reckon that's what I'd be taking out of that presentation, is what out of that whole carbon neutral approach do you think that you can adapt to your system? Carbon use efficiency, and I think that thread is really important. What are we doing? We're always looking around how many DSE we're carrying, what sort of production we're getting on water use efficiency, and how well we're running our systems. And Australia has got some well-run agronomic systems, but when we look at that carbon use efficiency, I think that's a really important piece. And I think looking at it to greater depth, like Christine touched on, is one of the missing elements into how we can really start maximising the numbers and our production systems here. The business plan. We've got to be all talking about our business plan. Like, it's a classic 101 just for your own business, but where does that fit when we start talking about our carbon neutral approach and beyond? And what we've got to be thinking about is a lot of these things that keep being brought up in front of you are key elements that have actually been tied together into the carbon market methodologies. So a business plan, like was touched on, saying what's your business plan to be carbon neutral? When you go into a carbon project, if you're looking at doing that, working to generate ACCUs, one of your requirements is to write a land management strategy. So what is your strategy over the next 5 years around what you're going to do differently? Like Amanda and Christine touched on, you can't keep doing what you've been doing and expect a different result. Something's got to change in your business, in your system, in how you're managing your landscape to generate this change, otherwise you won't be rewarded for it. Then the debate around that offsetting and insetting element. So we've got offsetting, which is when we're going to sell our credits and someone else is potentially going to be offsetting that, compared to the insetting, where it's like, I'm going to hold on to these carbon credits that I've generated and potentially offset my own system, which depends on which stream you're going down, whether it's the carbon neutral or the carbon trading side of things, is what the driver is. So finding out your why. So remembering that carbon neutral was more linked to the product, your end product component. So it's always just trying to link back to that why. What tier of target do you want to be involved in? I think that's the critical thing. There are a lot of targets around, and carbon neutral 2020 is part of like the macro size red meat carbon neutral 2030. But we can actually scale that right down to say, what is your target? You don't have to be carbon neutral by 2030, but what is your goal to be at by 2030? So we've got to think about that again for our own system. But really interesting on when we are looking at this, it's not free to build carbon. And Amanda touched on that, where we've got to change our system. And you even look at the Niels Olsen element, planting cover crops every 6 months, have a 100-gram machine. Like there's still expenses for that change of management. But we've got to remember that if we all get it right and we're all working together, there is a, touching on what the red meat industry have found, there's a link for consumers willing to pay 15% more for a carbon neutral product. So we've got to look at those opportunities from emissions avoidance. It's not just soil carbon, it's looking at that whole system. And ultimately, we've got to be reducing these variables. Part of that, like we touched on, is this additionality or newness component, which we're going to be doing differently. And you've, I think, had a plethora of some of these options today around trees to grazing to legumes, multi-species, improved pastures, and stepping forward from there. Then we had the PIRSA guns coming through and bringing some of the elements of what's going on in South Australia and what some of these drivers are around what climate adaptation has to offer as far as markets go. So carbon farming markets ultimately want to be minimising emissions, maximising sequestration, but it's also around productivity to that resilience. So trying to get those linkages together is what we're trying to achieve. The warming potential, it gets thrown around what the different elements are that we're actually trying to manage when it comes to soil carbon sequestration, to nitrous oxide, to methane. So we've got those multipliers. So each of them is actually not equivalent. So you've got something like soil carbon. Soil carbon, it's the one thing, I think, in the farming industry that the farmer's actually getting paid more for as a multiplier. So 1 tonne of soil carbon has a 3.67 multiplier to CO2 equivalents. So farmers have a win, so thank you for that. Methane, we've got the 23 or so times multiplier. Nitrous oxides, when we talk about nitrous oxide, it's all around its potency and how long it's persisting in the environment, but we've got over 300 times multiplier. So suddenly a kilo change in your nitrous oxide emissions can have a 300 kilo impact on the nitrous oxide emission factor. So yeah, really interesting on those components and what some of these market drivers are, because the market drivers is what's going to be really holding the steering wheel when we're talking about that steering earlier on. One of those really interesting ones, everyone's looking at the access to markets. The other side of it is going to be access to capital. And I think this is really exciting, especially when we start looking at what some of the incremental changes that need to occur. There are going to be some expenses on farm businesses. We're not going to be able to go cold turkey and change the system overnight. We've got to work with the financial institutions to work out how we can invest in our own systems to step this whole journey forward down the carbon neutral pathway. But of course, it's still consumer driven, so we've got to be selling our product at the end of the day. Co-benefits, obviously we've got these other benefits that go on from the carbon credits, biodiversity, and stepping that through. There are multiple pathways for you, and with Australia having a really robust crediting system, it's a great starting point for you to work from. The pathways include the trading of the ACCUs, carbon neutrality, and those co-benefits. So at the end of the day, all of this is around improving that efficiency and stepping it forward from there. We then move on to Amanda, keep going with PIRSA, is saying we start getting down from the market drivers down into the action on the ground. So what is soil carbon? So soil carbon can be a little bit confusing, but as we've stepped through that, we've actually found it's not just the plant matter on top that's breaking down, it's actually there's a lot more going on in that soil. And when we look at the dead microbes, being 30 to 50%, and then all those liquid carbon pathways that Christine touched on, there's a really complex system going on there. So what does that mean for our own systems? We've got the functions of organic matter, so that productivity, water, circulation, nutrient cycling, biological organisation, and then offsetting those greenhouse gases. So we've got to understand that we've got this multiple functional benefit to working with this soil carbon angle. but not all soil carbon's created equal. So there is always going to be debate around how much carbon you can be building on your farm, and it's so good to hear about the big step changes and reviewing data sets that have got, I guess, consistent changes over time is exciting to see. But I think what's really exciting is going through some of Christine's stuff and saying, is there another lever that we can now pull that to take some of those growth rates up? So the ability to maintain carbon is going to be the really critical thing we all work together on how we collaborate and ensure we're getting a positive outcome on this journey of soil carbon sequestration. We then need to maximise our water use efficiency and maximise productivity, and there's sort of two key elements that we can to build carbon that are metrics within our own system. Christine, we've just had Christine up here, but really I think that was enlightening conversation around how we can do something on the ground and what are some of the things that we can go home today and look at how can we take this monoculture that's potentially growing in the paddock just outside the back gate to then stepping that through on that journey. And I know there's a number of growers in the room who've played around with the multi-species covers, and it is really interesting science once it gets going. And one of those being, it was touched on around the soil carbon increasing by around 21.8% increase over the lower density crops when compared to the high density plots. Really interesting, some work out of South Australia. It's just been published from Joe Marks out of the University of Adelaide, looking at the bare undervine compared to undervine with cover crops. And he's found over the last 6 years that he's had a 23% increase in soil carbon under vine. So really exciting where that journey is going. So out of today, there's light at the end of the tunnel. There's different management strategies for you to tackle, and it's around how we get these to fit in your own system. At the end of the day, what we're still focusing on is environmental stability, environmental resilience, and how we can move through as a pathway of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon removal to carbon sequestration. How do we link that? Is it in soils? Is it in plants? The environment is depending on, well, as a solution, the environment is essentially, the agricultural industry has been engaged to work to do its bit on the environmental impacts and its attributes going forward. But at the end of the day, agriculture is there to benefit. So improved productivity, improved profitability, and climatic resilience is what we're trying to achieve out of the agricultural system. So by no means going away today and saying, this is all just for the environment. If someone's going to try and fleece me on getting my carbon credits and I'm left as a caretaker, look, don't get me wrong, there's still potentially a risk for that, but that risk element is going to be managed by you and your understanding of your own system and how we can step forward and make sure at every point you're being driven by still a stable agricultural system, but with improved environmental consequences, as opposed to currently, it's the capacity isn't being maximised for the environmental benefits. So how will you change a change in climate impact you? And thought just simplify that back to where the water goes, the carbon flows. So where are we going? Well, we're in such a variable environment here. Fleurieu Peninsula, love it. Born and bred on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and I think it's got the opportunity to be an amazing one from the marketing perspective as a region, an absolute textbook case study potentially for advancing the whole system of soil carbon and carbon neutral practices in general, and its potential on the global scale with how variable it is. And we talk about rainfall, and it was touched on 600 or so mils been like the rainfall in Iceland with different evaporation. We've got that. We've got also a spread just already of 300 mils up to nearly a metre of rainfall across the Hills Fleurieu region. So we've got so many different case studies that are essentially been developed. But it's how we then capture that and look to market going forward. And we've got to be aware of these environmental changes and what that's going to mean for marketing our produce. And for the wine industry especially, we might be looking at a hot vintage wine. So carbon neutral is a cycle, and I think we just want to make sure we're getting that, is that when you go home, you're looking at, I want to just store more carbon in the soil, and I have these discussions with growers. It's like, I just want to start parking carbon in my soil. And you've been growing plants for the last 100 years here. How are we going to change that? It's like, no, I'm just going to start measuring it and it's going to start changing. It's not that simple, and we've got to be doing something different, and it is a requirement too. So we've got to look at our inflows and outflows. It was touched on a couple of times. Looking at our fertiliser usage, diesel, where all our emissions coming from is a critical piece we've got to balance out in this, because we can't be carbon neutral just because we're measuring it. So really, how I've tried to simplify it is trying to work out your why. Each and every one of you in the room here is going to have a different reason, maybe similar, but ultimately different motivation and driver as to why you want to be carbon neutral at your own farm gate level, carbon neutral for the industry, carbon neutral for on the global scale. So stepping through that and saying, what are we trying to improve? Where are you trying to improve? Is it just, are we going to just try and reduce our emissions? Are we going to try and store carbon? We don't have to do this all at once. So how can we go on this journey of improving our productivity and profitability of our systems, maintaining market access, and essentially that triple bottom line of that people, planet and prosperity, because there are key elements and different practices. You don't have to do a blanket approach, and especially in the Fleurieu system, we've got a variable landform like no other really on the soil variation, and this is what we've got to try and capture. Thought I'd bring the Fleurieu to you, and this is essentially a snapshot of a number of different soil pits from around the Fleurieu region, from just here at Lenswood right down to Parawa, out to Langhorne Creek and around. We do have soil variability, significant soil variability, and it's trying to work out how do we best leverage your own system. So rule number one, always dig a hole. I'm soils biased, but I always still say that. Unless you dig a hole, you can't understand where this variability is going to come from. Where there's variability, there's opportunity. Again, Christine touched on it as well. Don't know how this is going to work. Christine touched on it as well. When we look at our top soils, is that top one being the magnifier? So when we look at soils, we've obviously got multiple layers in a soil, and this is what we've got to understand, and this is where 0 to 10 soil testing can be take you away from what's actually going on down through the profiles. So we've got that high cycling environment at the top, then we transition into potentially a bleached soil, not a lot of roots, then we've got this horsepower of clay sitting underneath that we're underutilising. So are we maximising our own soil profiles to maximise what we're trying to produce? So understanding your own soils, and we could dissect that for days just on this one slide. So where to from here? We want to be aligning the pieces of the puzzle in your system. So don't have the answers for each and every one of you. It's trying to look within your system and step through. So we want to be bringing these key elements together. We've touched on what is soil carbon. Why do we need soil carbon? Why do we want to increase soil carbon? What impacts is going to have on market access? And what impacts on the climate and environment? That's really what we've tried to capture here today. And I think, like I say, each and every one of you is going to take a different element out of this, but it's trying to find what's your biggest lever to pull. But for me, going home, first thing I'd be doing is trying to understand your variability. Everything to do with the carbon market is about variability. If you've got high variability and don't know that you've got the variability, you've got higher chance of getting discounted on what carbon that's going to be measured. So this is where understanding, have I got a 3% carbon zone, a 2% carbon zone, a 1% carbon zone? We want to know some of those things. And is it all trapped in the topsoil, or is it evenly distributed down to 30 centimetres and what's down in the profile? So understand your soils to depth. Can't recommend that more, and I think highlighting what Christine touched on, seeing some of those changes that are often occurring outside of the commonly measured zone. Then we do have to identify those barriers or constraints to the system. There's no point trying to push a certain management practice on the wrong soils, because you just won't get the response out of it. So linking back to what Amanda touched on, is saying we've got to be identifying our constraints, and then we can manage for them. And that means that we can zone up our properties for a carbon plan that really guides us to say that what we do differently on this area might have high sodium in the soils, might be different to another area where we might have low pH. So what have we done and what can we do? Simple as that on what we should be thinking about as we leave here today. Just wanted to do a snapshot of a soil carbon project that I was involved with around variability. So first, these are number of soil tests taken. The first one in the order is a 0 to 30, then 30 to 100, 0 to 30, 30 to 100. And we can see that variability of what's going on in the topsoils to what's going in the subsoils. Again, variability obviously within those topsoil ones. You can see that peak through the middle. We've got obviously a cluster on the property that is higher carbon. Why is that? And then what does that mean for the soil carbon below? So these are the questions we have to ask when we've got the data to leverage. Then, if nothing else, I want you to go and review your own system. What are we doing on the simplicity of when you strip soil back, we've got a soil physical, chemical and biological component to it. How are we influencing it with our current management? These are the things that really start driving what should be our first step forward. Because we can't keep looking through the fence and say, oh, that worked there, when we've got something that might be hindering us before that. And out of today, we've got to be looking at, this is a cog, this is a cycle, this is a whole gearbox of our whole scenario that we're trying to do. We can simplify it down to a triangle of chemical, physical and biological elements, but at the end of the day, it's so dynamic around the water that's coming in, the soil type that you've got, the soil organic matter that's been contributed, and then what's been stored as that stable soil carbon, which remember, has got to go through that particulate phase, that labile carbon stored around that mineral-associated carbon. So for me, working through some different growers, you can start really simply and say, right, what are my inputs? List them out and say, what impact does that have where? So I've put gypsum out. That has an impact on my soil physical condition, but it's a chemical product, calcium sulfate. Might be something like lime, has an impact on all three. It has an impact on pH, so it changes around the biological activity. Physical, it's got calcium, then the chemistry, obviously it's calcium carbonate. Go fertilisers, high chemistry, some can be suppressive to biology, some can stimulate. So we've got to work out where's this fertiliser, is it organic, is it inorganic? We can look at that compost and manures, where does that fit in? Inoculants or biostimulants, where do they sit? And once you actually, and then going to something like your tillage, which is physical intervention, where does the balance of your triangle sit? Because that can start guiding you into some of the questions like, might be that I don't have enough, ticked all the right boxes on the biological side of things, but yeah, I'm still running a monoculture, so is it an option to look at the multi-species, or have I been falling short on, got everything else right, but got a really sodic soil, high sodium soil, or my pH is just down below 5, got massive issues that are really restricting the system that we need to overcome. So identify your opportunities for additionality. So if you're going into a carbon project or not, we've got to be thinking about what can we be doing differently, because once you set a new trajectory, we've got to maintain it. So I'm closing up on where there is soil, there is opportunity. The mindset is right. Everyone in this room is thinking about what can you be doing, is it worth pursuing, and how can I start on this journey of being carbon neutral. The market opportunities are right, or may not be 100% right, but they're evolving. They're in the right trajectory. The carbon market's evolving. Yes, there's some volatility still in it, but it is evolving. After sitting there at that $20 to now spiking up to 60, there's activity. And the management options are available. It's just now matching those management options available with your management system and the flexibility that comes there. So action is required. Remembering back at Peter Hayman's denial and despair leads to inaction. I think out of today, action is required, and we've got the tools to start leading down that action path. And purely by chance, I touched on this, if you remember back to Peter Hayman, touching on rising tides produce the biggest waves. But I think with everyone in the room, the rising tide does lift all boats, and we're going to find that with the carbon market, the development of all the different industry groups on having these carbon neutral targets. And then critically, that's at the higher level, but at the farm gate level, is the over-the-fence developments that occur from groups like this, sharing their knowledge and the insights around how we can be managing these soils on the Fleurieu and finding that fit within the different carbon methodologies, whether it's accredited through the government or the voluntary international markets. There's huge opportunities. That's going to be a pretty remarkable trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a wrap from me. So thank you for your time. And we'll